In the ancient world, long before the rise of modern medicine, humanity discovered a plant that would change the course of human history forever. The opium poppy, with its delicate petals and mysterious properties, grew wild across the Mediterranean and Middle East, calling to those who suffered, promising relief from the unbearable weight of pain. The story begins in Mesopotamia, around 3400 BCE, where the Sumerians first cultivated the opium poppy. They called it Hulgil, the joy plant, and they were not wrong. This seemingly innocent flower contained within its seed pod a milky latex that, when dried, produced a substance of extraordinary power. The Sumerians didn't understand the chemistry, couldn't fathom the molecules at work, but they knew one undeniable truth: this plant could take away pain. Imagine being a farmer in ancient Sumer, working under the relentless sun, your back screaming from hours bent over crops. Then someone hands you a small amount of dried opium. Within minutes the pain dissolves. Your worries fade. The world becomes softer, warmer, more bearable. Is it any wonder that this knowledge spread like wildfire across the ancient world? The Egyptians embraced opium with fervour. Papyrus scrolls from 1500 BCE detail its use, and the famous Ebers papyrus prescribes opium for crying children. Think about that for a moment. Parents thousands of years ago, desperate to soothe their suffering infants, reached for the same substance that would later grip entire nations in addiction. The Greeks and Romans continued this tradition. Hippocrates, the father of medicine himself, prescribed opium. The great physician Galen used it extensively in his treatments. But opium in its raw form was unpredictable. Too little and it did nothing. Too much and it could kill. The dosage was impossible to standardize because the potency varied wildly from poppy to poppy, from harvest to harvest. For thousands of years, physicians worked in the dark, guessing at amounts, hoping for the best, sometimes watching their patients slip into a sleep from which they would never wake. Then came Friedrich Sertürner, a German pharmacist's assistant working in the small town of Paderborn. The year was 1804, and Europe was consumed by the Napoleonic Wars. Sertürner was just 20 years old, an apprentice with little formal education, but possessed of an insatiable curiosity. While his master slept, Sertürner conducted experiments in the back of the pharmacy, working by candlelight, mixing and heating and crystallizing. What Sertürner did was revolutionary. He isolated the active ingredient in opium, the specific chemical compound responsible for its pain-relieving properties. From the complex mixture of alkaloids in opium, he extracted pure white crystals of a substance he initially called Principium somniferum, the sleep-bringing principle. Later he renamed it Morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. This was alchemy becomes science. For the first time in human history, doctors could administer a precise dose of a pain reliever. No more guesswork. No more hoping the opium tincture wasn't too strong or too weak. Morphine was standardized, measurable, reliable. Sertürner tested it on himself and 3 young friends, documenting their experiences meticulously. They all experienced the same effects: relief, euphoria, and then terrifying side effects that made them violently ill. Sertürner had discovered both morphine's promise and its danger in a single experiment. But the medical establishment was slow to recognize the significance of Sertürner's discovery. He published his findings in 1805, but they were largely ignored. It wasn't until 1817, when he published a more detailed account, that the medical world began to pay attention. Even then, Sertürner never received the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. He died in 1841, bitter and addicted to the very substance he had discovered. The 1850s brought a technological revolution that would amplify morphine's impact exponentially: the hypodermic syringe. Alexander Wood, a Scottish physician, and Charles Gabriel Pravaz, a French surgeon, independently developed practical syringes for injecting medications directly into the bloodstream. Suddenly, morphine could bypass the digestive system entirely, delivering its effects with stunning speed and intensity. Injection changed everything. When morphine is taken orally, it has to be absorbed through the stomach and liver, which breaks down much of it before it reaches the brain. But injected morphine goes straight into the bloodstream, reaching the brain within seconds. The relief is immediate and profound. For patients suffering from unbearable pain, it must have seemed like a miracle. And for a time, physicians believed they had found a miracle without a price. In the mid-19th century, the prevailing medical theory was that morphine addiction only occurred when the drug was taken orally. If you injected it, many doctors believed addiction was impossible. This catastrophic misunderstanding would lead to one of the greatest medical disasters in history. The American Civil War began in 1861, and it was a conflict of unprecedented brutality. New weapons, particularly the rifled musket, caused horrific injuries. Minié balls tore through flesh and shattered bones in ways that earlier smoothbore weapons never had. Field hospitals were overwhelmed with screaming, dying men. Surgeons worked in conditions we can barely imagine today. No antibiotics, limited anesthesia, primitive tools, and waves upon waves of wounded soldiers. In this hellish landscape, morphine was a godsend. Battlefield surgeons used it liberally. A soldier with a shattered leg awaiting amputation could be given morphine and experience relief within moments. Men dying slowly from gut wounds could spend their final hours in a morphine-induced haze rather than screaming agony. The medical corps distributed morphine widely, and soldiers often carried their own supplies. Consider the scale. The Civil War produced approximately 400,000 wounded Union soldiers alone, not counting Confederate casualties. Countless thousands received morphine, many repeatedly over days or weeks of treatment. And here's the tragic irony. While morphine relieved their battlefield wounds, it created a different kind of casualty. After the war ended in 1865, something strange began to happen. Veterans who had been treated with morphine during the war found they couldn't stop using it. They experienced terrible symptoms when they tried to quit: sweating, shaking, aching bones, anxiety, insomnia, and an overwhelming craving for more morphine. Many had been given morphine syringes to take home. Some had been shown how to inject themselves. They were fighting a new war now, one against their own bodies. Doctors began to recognize a pattern they called the army disease, or soldier's disease. Thousands of veterans were addicted to morphine. Some estimates suggested that over 400,000 veterans suffered from morphine addiction, though accurate statistics are impossible to determine. These men had survived the war's bullets and cannonballs only to be enslaved by a substance their own doctors had given them. The syndrome wasn't limited to soldiers. As morphine became more widely available in the late 19th century, addiction spread through all levels of society. But it was the soldier's plight that gave it its name and brought it to public attention. Veterans, already struggling with the physical and psychological trauma of war, now faced the additional burden of addiction. Imagine being one of these men. You survived Gettysburg or Antietam. You lived through the horror of amputation in a field hospital. The morphine made it bearable. But now, years later, you can't function without it. Your family doesn't understand. Your hands shake. You can't work. The only relief comes from that same substance that once saved you from pain. The medicine has become the disease. The late 19th century was the golden age of patent medicines in America, and morphine was a common ingredient in countless preparations. Tonics, cough syrups, and remedies for everything from teething babies to women's troubles contained morphine, often unlabeled. Housewives became addicted to their medicine cabinet staples. Children were given morphine-laced soothing syrups. Addiction was democratic in the worst possible way, affecting the wealthy and poor, young and old, men and women. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed for teething babies and restless children, contained morphine. Millions of bottles were sold. Countless infants were inadvertently addicted, or worse, fatally overdosed. The manufacturers claimed it was perfectly safe. After all, morphine was a medicine, wasn't it? How could medicine be dangerous? The medical profession was slowly coming to grips with a terrible realization. Morphine was powerfully addictive, regardless of how it was administered. The theory that injection prevented addiction was devastatingly wrong. Moreover, they discovered that morphine addiction was one of the most difficult conditions to treat. Users who tried to quit experienced withdrawal symptoms so severe that many preferred to remain addicted rather than endure the suffering of quitting. Withdrawal from morphine is a unique form of torture. It typically begins 6 to 12 hours after the last dose. First comes anxiety and restlessness. Then the physical symptoms arrive: muscle aches that feel like your bones are breaking, waves of hot and cold sweats, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Your legs jerk uncontrollably, giving rise to the term kicking the habit. You can't sleep. Every nerve is on fire. This continues for days, sometimes weeks. And through it all, you know that a single dose of morphine would make it all stop immediately. The craving is perhaps the worst part. It's not just wanting morphine, it's needing it with every fibre of your being. Former addicts described it as being worse than thirst or hunger, a consuming need that overwhelms every other thought. Some doctors in the late 1800s believed morphine addiction was incurable. Many addicts agreed, having tried and failed to quit multiple times. Medical understanding of addiction was primitive. Some doctors believed it was a moral failing, a lack of willpower. Others thought it was a disease, but had no idea what caused it or how to treat it. Addiction sanitariums opened across America, promising cures. Some used the cold turkey method, abruptly stopping morphine and letting patients suffer through withdrawal. Others gradually reduced doses. Some used other drugs to ease symptoms. Few achieved lasting success. The early 20th century brought growing alarm about addiction in America. Physicians began calling for regulations on morphine and other opiates. The medical journals filled with articles about the addiction crisis. Cities reported growing numbers of addicts. New York, San Francisco, and other major urban centers had thriving black markets for morphine. But morphine's medical utility couldn't be denied. It remained the gold standard for severe pain. No other drug could match its effectiveness. Cancer patients, surgical patients, trauma victims, all depended on morphine for relief. The medical profession faced a terrible dilemma. How do you control a dangerous, addictive substance that is also medically indispensable? The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 was America's first major attempt to regulate opiates. It required doctors and pharmacists to register and pay taxes on narcotics. More importantly, it restricted narcotics to legitimate medical use, making recreational use illegal. The law transformed addiction from a medical problem into a criminal one virtually overnight. Thousands of addicts who had been able to obtain morphine legally suddenly found themselves cut off. Doctors, afraid of legal repercussions, stopped treating addicts. The black market exploded. Morphine that cost pennies legally now sold for dollars illegally. Crime associated with addiction skyrocketed as desperate addicts turned to theft and prostitution to fund their habits. The Harrison Act created another class of victims: physicians who believed addiction should be treated as a medical condition. Doctors who continued prescribing morphine to maintain addicts were arrested and imprisoned. The medical profession largely abandoned addiction treatment, and addicts were left to suffer or turn to crime. This approach to addiction, treating it as a criminal rather than medical problem, would dominate American policy for most of the 20th century. World War I brought morphine back to the forefront of medicine. The war's industrialized slaughter created casualties on a scale never before seen. Machine guns, artillery, poison gas. The weapons of modern warfare inflicted horrific injuries. Once again, morphine was essential battlefield medicine. But this time, the medical profession was wary, aware of the addiction potential. Military doctors tried to balance pain relief against addiction risk. They used morphine more sparingly than Civil War surgeons had, trying to reserve it for the most severe cases. But the sheer volume of wounded made restraint difficult. By the war's end in 1918, addiction among veterans was again a concern, though perhaps not as widespread as after the Civil War. The interwar period saw continued research into morphine and its effects. Scientists began to understand that morphine worked by binding to specific receptors in the brain and spinal cord. These receptors, they eventually discovered, were designed to respond to the body's own natural pain relievers, endorphins. Morphine was a molecular key that fit perfectly into locks designed for the body's own chemicals. This discovery was profound. It meant that morphine addiction wasn't just a matter of willpower or moral weakness. The drug was literally hijacking the brain's natural pain and pleasure systems. With repeated use, the brain adapted, reducing its own production of endorphins and increasing the number of receptors. The addicted brain physically needed morphine to function normally. World War II once again made morphine a military necessity. The Pacific and European theatres produced millions of casualties. Morphine syrettes, small disposable injection devices, were issued to medics and soldiers. These spring-loaded syringes could be used with one hand, even by wounded soldiers on themselves. The morphine syrette became an iconic symbol of battlefield medicine. Stories from the war illustrate morphine's dual nature. It saved countless lives, allowing wounded soldiers to survive evacuation from the battlefield. Medics were heroes, racing through gunfire to reach wounded men and administer morphine. But some soldiers who received repeated doses during treatment developed dependencies. The addiction problem was less severe than after the Civil War, partly because medical knowledge had improved and partly because morphine was used more judiciously. The post-war period brought new synthetic opioids that were supposed to be less addictive than morphine. Each time the promise was the same: all the pain relief of morphine without the addiction risk. Each time the promise proved false. Heroin, synthesized from morphine in 1874, was initially marketed as a non-addictive morphine substitute. It proved to be even more addictive. Oxycodone, hydrocodone, and other synthetic opioids followed, each claimed to be safer, each ultimately proving to be addictive. The Vietnam War brought a different kind of addiction crisis. Unlike previous conflicts, marijuana and heroin were readily available in Vietnam. Some soldiers used heroin recreationally, not for pain management. Studies suggested that up to 20% of soldiers in Vietnam tried heroin. The Pentagon panicked, fearing an epidemic when these soldiers returned home. But something surprising happened. Most soldiers who used heroin in Vietnam stopped using it when they came home. This contradicted the prevailing belief that heroin addiction was essentially permanent. Researchers began to understand that environment and stress played crucial roles in addiction. The soldiers had used heroin to cope with the unbearable stress of combat. Once removed from that environment, most were able to stop. This finding revolutionized addiction theory. Addiction wasn't purely chemical, it was also psychological and environmental. This explains why some people can use opioids medically for pain without becoming addicted, while others quickly develop dependencies. The brain's pain and pleasure systems are complicated, influenced by trauma, stress, mental health, and individual biology. Modern medicine still relies heavily on morphine. For severe acute pain after surgery, from traumatic injuries, or in the final stages of terminal illnesses, morphine remains unsurpassed. Oncologists use it to give dying cancer patients comfort in their final days. Emergency physicians use it to treat heart attack, victims and trauma patients. It is quite literally indispensable. But the pendulum has swung back and forth between access and restriction throughout morphine's history. In the 1990s and early 2000s, pain management advocates successfully argued that doctors were undertreating pain out of fear of addiction. Opioid prescribing skyrocketed. Pharmaceutical companies assured doctors that new opioid formulations were safe and rarely addictive. These assurances proved catastrophically wrong. The opioid epidemic that began in the late 1990s has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. It began with prescription opioids like OxyContin, but evolved into a crisis involving heroin and synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Morphine itself is less often implicated than these other drugs, but it's part of the same family, working through the same brain mechanisms, carrying the same addiction risks. The current crisis has led to restrictions on opioid prescribing. Many pain patients now struggle to get adequate treatment because doctors fear regulatory consequences or contributing to addiction. We've returned to an old dilemma. How do we provide pain relief to those who genuinely need it while preventing addiction and diversion to non-medical use? Recent research offers some hope. Scientists are working on new pain medications that might provide relief without addiction potential. Some target different receptors than morphine. Others try to separate pain relief from euphoria. Gene therapy and targeted nerve treatments might someday provide pain relief without systemic drugs, but so far nothing matches morphine's effectiveness for severe pain. Understanding addiction has also improved dramatically. We now know it's a chronic brain disease, not a moral failing. Effective treatments exist, including medication-assisted treatment that uses drugs like methadone or buprenorphine to prevent withdrawal and reduce cravings. Behavioral therapies help address the psychological aspects of addiction. Recovery is possible, though it remains difficult. The story of morphine is ultimately a story about humanity's relationship with both pain and pleasure. Pain is universal. Every human who has ever lived has experienced it. Severe pain is unbearable in ways that are hard to convey to those who haven't experienced it. It's not just uncomfortable, it's devastating, obliterating your ability to think, to function, to be yourself. Morphine offers escape from that suffering, but escape comes at a price. The same mechanism that relieves pain also creates euphoria. The same drug that makes life bearable for cancer patients can enslave healthy people who use it recreationally. Morphine doesn't judge or discriminate. It simply acts on receptors in the brain, producing effects that can be salvation or damnation depending on context. Consider the wounded soldier in the Civil War field hospital. Morphine saved him from dying in screaming agony. Was it worth the addiction that followed? Most soldiers would say yes. The alternative was unthinkable. Consider the cancer patient in the modern hospice, dying of metastatic disease. Morphine gives them weeks or months of relative comfort instead of unbearable suffering. The addiction risk is irrelevant when life is measured in days. But consider also the recreational user who tries heroin once at a party. That person is playing Russian roulette with their brain's chemistry. Some people can use opioids and walk away, others can't. We don't fully understand why. Genetics plays a role. Trauma and mental health matter. but there's still an element of unpredictability that makes every use a gamble. The medical profession continues to grapple with these issues. Clinical guidelines now emphasize using the lowest effective dose of opioids for the shortest time necessary. Doctors are supposed to screen for addiction risk factors. Alternative pain treatments are tried first. When opioids are necessary, patients are monitored closely. These precautions help but aren't foolproof. Emergency medicine presents particular challenges. When a patient arrives screaming in pain from kidney stones or a broken bone, should the doctor worry about addiction potential or provide immediate relief? Most doctors choose compassion, administering morphine or similar drugs, but that single dose can, in rare cases, be the first step toward addiction for a susceptible individual. Palliative care has pioneered a balanced approach. When treating terminal patients, the goal is comfort, not longevity. Morphine doses are carefully calibrated to relieve suffering while maintaining quality of life. Patients might become physically dependent, but this is considered acceptable when facing death. The moral calculus changes when pain relief competes with weeks or months of life rather than years. The stigma surrounding addiction remains a major barrier to treatment. Despite scientific evidence that addiction is a brain disease, many people still view it as a character flaw. Addicts face discrimination in healthcare, employment, and housing. This stigma prevents people from seeking help and makes recovery more difficult. As long as we view addiction through a moral rather than medical lens, we'll struggle to address it effectively. Recent neuroscience has revealed that addiction literally rewires the brain. Brain scans of addicts show changes in the regions responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and pleasure. These changes can persist for months or years after quitting. This explains why addiction is so often chronic, with high relapse rates. The addict isn't weak-willed. Their brain has been fundamentally altered. Treatment approaches have evolved accordingly. Modern addiction treatment recognizes that willpower alone is usually insufficient. Medication to manage withdrawal and cravings, combined with therapy to address underlying psychological issues, gives addicts the best chance of recovery. Support systems, family, friends, support groups are crucial. Recovery is rarely a straight line. Relapses are common and should be expected rather than treated as failures. The legacies of morphine addiction from past wars persist. Some World War II and Korean War veterans struggled with addiction throughout their lives. Vietnam veterans faced their own demons. More recently, veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have battled opioid addiction, sometimes stemming from legitimate treatment for combat injuries, sometimes from recreational use. The VA health system has worked to address veteran addiction, with mixed results. Veterans face unique challenges: combat trauma, PTSD, physical injuries, and the difficulty of transitioning to civilian life all increase addiction risk. Many turn to opioids to self-medicate psychological pain. Breaking this cycle requires comprehensive treatment addressing both addiction and underlying mental health issues. Looking at morphine's 2-century history as an isolated compound, patterns emerge. Each generation believes it has found a way to harness morphine's benefits without its costs. Each generation is proven wrong. The Civil War doctors thought injection prevented addiction. 1960s researchers thought methadone was a safe substitute. 1990s physicians thought OxyContin couldn't be abused. Every time reality intervened, perhaps the lesson is that there is no free lunch with opioids. The same molecular mechanism that relieves pain also creates euphoria and addiction potential. These effects cannot be separated because they arise from the same receptor binding. A painkiller without addiction potential might not be an opioid at all. It would have to work through an entirely different mechanism. Research continues. Some promising avenues include nerve blocks that numb specific areas without systemic drugs, gene therapies that might dial down pain signaling, and non-opioid pain medications targeting different pathways. Virtual reality has shown promise in distracting patients from pain. Cognitive behavioral therapy can help people manage chronic pain without drugs, but none of these replaces morphine for severe acute pain. The pharmaceutical industry's role in the current opioid crisis has been controversial. Companies that manufactured and marketed opioids have faced lawsuits for allegedly downplaying addiction risks and aggressively marketing to doctors. Some have paid billions in settlements. The Sackler family, owners of Purdue Pharma, became particularly notorious. They have been accused of deliberately fostering addiction for profit, though they deny wrongdoing. This raises ethical questions about profit motives in medicine. Pain relief is valuable. Patients suffering from severe pain deserve treatment, but when pharmaceutical companies prioritize profits over safety, when they fund studies designed to minimize addiction concerns, when they pay doctors to prescribe their drugs, where is the line between legitimate business and criminal negligence? The regulation of morphine and other opioids varies dramatically worldwide. Some countries make them readily available for medical use, trusting doctors and patients to use them responsibly. Others restrict them heavily, even for terminal cancer patients, prioritizing addiction prevention over pain relief. The World Health Organization has criticized countries that undertreat pain due to excessive fear of addiction. Finding the right balance is perhaps impossible. Too restrictive, and people suffer unnecessarily. Too permissive, and addiction flourishes. Individual countries and individual doctors within those countries must make difficult judgment calls. These decisions have profound consequences for real people. The cancer patient denied adequate pain relief, the addict enabled by a too generous prescription, the child who finds their parents' pills. Cultural attitudes toward pain and drug use also play a role. Some cultures view pain as something to be endured stoically. Others see untreated pain as a failure of medicine. Some cultures stigmatize drug use heavily. Others are more tolerant. These attitudes influence everything from prescribing patterns to addiction rates to treatment availability. Friedrich Sertürner, working by candlelight in 1804, could not have imagined any of this. He was trying to make medicine more precise, more scientific. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Morphine has relieved more suffering than almost any other drug in history. Surgical patients, accident victims, dying patients' millions have been spared unbearable agony because of Sertürner's discovery. But he also unleashed something dangerous. Morphine has destroyed countless lives, torn apart families, and fueled crime and misery. The soldier's disease of the Civil War era was just the beginning. Every generation since has faced its own version of the opioid crisis. The details change the drugs, the demographics, the delivery methods, but the underlying tragedy remains the same. So what is morphine ultimately? Miracle or menace? Medicine or poison? The answer, frustratingly, is both. It depends entirely on context. Who uses it, why they use it, how they use it, and when they use it. A dying cancer patient and a recreational heroin user might both be using the same class of drug, but their situations could not be more different morally, medically, or socially. This ambiguity makes morphine policy so difficult. We cannot simply ban it. Too many people depend on it for legitimate medical reasons. We cannot make it freely available. The addiction potential is too high. We muddle through with regulations and guidelines, trying to maximize benefits while minimizing harms, never quite succeeding at either. Individual stories illustrate these complexities better than statistics. The grandmother with metastatic breast cancer who spends her final months pain-free thanks to morphine, able to enjoy time with her grandchildren. The young veteran who survived Afghanistan but couldn't survive his morphine addiction, dead of an overdose at 25. The chronic pain patient whose life improved dramatically with opioid treatment, but who must fight insurance companies and suspicious doctors for every prescription. The teenager who experimented with heroin and lost everything: education, relationships, health to addiction. Each of these stories is true, and thousands more like them play out every day. Morphine continues to be both humanity's greatest pain reliever and one of our most dangerous addictive substances. This paradox has existed since Sertürner's isolation of the pure compound and shows no sign of resolution. The current opioid crisis in America has killed more people than the entire Vietnam War. Drug overdoses, mostly involving opioids, now kill over 100,000 Americans annually. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times more potent than morphine, has become particularly deadly. Street drugs are increasingly contaminated with fentanyl, leading to accidental overdoses. Users think they're taking heroin or even cocaine, but unknowingly ingest fentanyl and die. This crisis has touched nearly every American family. Everyone knows someone affected by opioid addiction: a relative, a friend, a co-worker. The face of addiction has changed. It's no longer confined to stereotyped junkies in city slums. It's the suburban teenager, the injured construction worker, the middle-aged housewife, the respected professional. Addiction is democratic in the truest sense. It can strike anyone. Treatment capacity remains inadequate. Many addicts want help but cannot access it. Treatment centers have waiting lists. Insurance coverage is limited. Medication-assisted treatment, which is highly effective, remains underutilized. The criminal justice system is overwhelmed with drug-related offenses. We've returned to the post-Harrison Act situation, treating addiction as a crime rather than a medical condition. Some cities and states are trying new approaches. Needle exchange programs reduce HIV and hepatitis transmission among injection drug users. Supervised injection sites allow users to inject under medical supervision, preventing overdose deaths. Naloxone, a drug that reverses opioid overdoses, is now widely available. These harm reduction strategies are controversial but have saved lives. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001 and saw dramatic improvements in addiction rates and overdose deaths. Instead of arresting drug users, Portugal treats addiction as a public health issue. Users are offered treatment, not jail time. This approach remains controversial in more conservative countries, but has proven successful by most metrics. The future of morphine and pain management is uncertain. Will we develop truly non-addictive pain relievers? Will we find better ways to treat addiction? Will we learn to balance compassionate pain treatment with addiction prevention? Or will we continue cycling between periods of permissive prescribing and restrictive regulation, never quite getting it right? What seems certain is that morphine itself will remain medically important for the foreseeable future. No other drug equals its effectiveness for severe acute pain. Terminal patients will continue to need it. Trauma and surgical patients will depend on it. The challenge is ensuring that those who need it can access it while preventing non-medical use and addiction. Education plays a crucial role. Doctors need better training in pain management and addiction recognition. Patients need to understand both the benefits and risks of opioids. Young people need honest drug education that doesn't exaggerate or minimize dangers. The current approach, which often involves simplistic, just say no messaging, has clearly failed. Prescription monitoring programs, which track opioid prescriptions across providers and pharmacies, have helped identify doctor shopping and excessive prescribing, but they also create barriers for legitimate patients. Finding the sweet spot between preventing abuse and ensuring access remains challenging. The economic costs of the opioid crisis are staggering. Lost productivity, healthcare costs, criminal justice expenses, and addiction treatment run into hundreds of billions of dollars annually. But the human cost is incalculable. Each overdose death is a tragedy, a life cut short, a family devastated. Each person enslaved by addiction represents lost potential, shattered dreams. Some pharmaceutical companies are developing abuse-deterrent formulations of opioids. These pills are harder to crush and snort or dissolve and inject. But determined addicts find ways around these barriers, and abuse-deterrent formulations are more expensive, putting them out of reach for some patients. The tension between pain relief and addiction prevention will likely never fully resolve. They pull in opposite directions. Maximum pain relief requires generous opioid use, while addiction prevention requires restrictive use. Individual doctors must make judgment calls with each patient, weighing pain severity, addiction risk, alternative treatments, and patient preferences. Modern palliative care demonstrates that it's possible to use morphine compassionately and effectively. Hospice doctors routinely manage pain in dying patients without causing problematic addiction. The key is appropriate dosing, careful monitoring, and focusing on the patient's quality of life. Lessons from palliative care could inform broader opioid use. The story of morphine is far from over. 2 centuries after Sertürner's discovery, we're still grappling with the same fundamental questions. How do we relieve suffering without creating new suffering? How do we help those in pain without enabling addiction? How do we show compassion to both pain patients and addicts? Perhaps perfect answers don't exist. Perhaps we'll always be balancing competing goods and accepting trade-offs. The soldier facing amputation without anesthesia versus the veteran struggling with addiction. The cancer patient's final months of comfort versus the addiction risk. The acute pain patient's immediate relief versus the small chance of long-term dependence. What we can do is approach these questions with humility, recognizing that morphine is powerful medicine in both the best and worst senses. We can fund addiction treatment and research into better pain medications. We can educate honestly about risks and benefits. We can treat addicts with compassion rather than contempt. We can ensure that those dying in pain have access to relief. The ancient Sumerians called the opium poppy the joy plant. They weren't wrong, but joy came with a price they couldn't have understood. 4,000 years later, we understand the price better, but still struggle to decide whether it's worth paying. For the dying cancer patient, yes, absolutely. For the curious teenager, no, never. For everyone in between, the answer is complicated. Morphine remains one of humanity's most important and most dangerous discoveries. It has the power to relieve unbearable suffering and the power to enslave and destroy. It represents both the heights of medical achievement and the depths of addiction's misery. It is Sertürner's gift and his curse, our salvation and our downfall, proof that the most powerful medicines can also be the most dangerous. As you drift towards sleep, consider this. Somewhere right now, morphine is saving someone's life, making their final days bearable, or allowing them to survive a horrific injury. Simultaneously, somewhere else, someone is dying of a morphine or heroin overdose, or destroying their life through addiction. The same molecule, the same drug, opposite outcomes. That paradox has existed for 200 years and will likely continue for 200 more. The complete history of morphine is still being written. Each day adds new chapters. Breakthroughs in pain management, tragedies of addiction, policy debates, medical advances. Friedrich Sertürner could not have imagined where his discovery would lead, the millions it would help, the millions it would harm. His legacy is complex, neither wholly good nor wholly bad, a reminder that scientific progress always carries unforeseen consequences. So as you close your eyes tonight, spare a thought for the pain. Patients finally finding relief, the addicts struggling toward recovery, the doctors trying to make impossible choices, and the researchers working to find better answers. Spare a thought too for Sertürner, working by candlelight, extracting white crystals, changing the world forever without knowing how. The story of morphine is the story of medicine itself, trying to help, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, always learning, never finished.